Thanks very much, Ben. I'm absolutely delighted with the panel we have today. And just to introduce the folks who are joining me, Ulrich Kelber, who is the Federal Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information in Germany, Alberto Bacchiega, the Director of Markets and Cases for Financial Services and the Directorate General for Competition in the European Commission, Will Hayter, Senior Director of the Digital Markets Unit within the Competition Markets Authority in the UK, and finally Christoph Busch, Professor of European Private and Business Law at the University of Osnabrück and a visiting fellow at Yale, a fellow and council member at the European Law Institute. So welcome, panel. We're going to start off, as Ben said, talking about Bigness, and some of the internet companies currently trading are some of the largest companies which have ever existed, and certainly they dominate the stock markets. Is being big a problem in and of itself? And if so, why? How big is too big? If we start off, maybe I would love to hear a perspective from Alberto. Would you like to share your perspectives, Alberto?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to exchange views today. So if is big a problem in itself, I would say no. I would also go a little bit further. Is to be dominant a problem in itself? Again, the answer is no. And in fact, dominance is not in itself a problem, as we all know, is abuse of dominance that is a problem. What is certainly that with size and with bigness come special responsibility on the front of competition law. And therefore, big, but more importantly, dominant companies need to be much more careful than other companies in the way they behave on the market and the way they interrelate with other companies in the market. I think for me, the long and the short of the answer is here. Not really, but there are higher responsibilities for big companies.
Interesting. Thank you very much for that perspective, Alberto. And I guess in terms of the UK's perspective, does it vary from the European view, Will?
Thanks very much, Nick, and thank you very much to the organisers for having me on indeed what is an excellent panel. I would note, and I was rather late to register this, but it is the one. My one regret is that it is a manel rather than a panel today, and I would rather it wasn't so. But anyway, that being said, on to the question. So, I mean, broadly speaking, a similar sort of answer actually to Alberto. Absolutely fine if companies are big. What we worry about is if they wield power in a harmful way. And in these tech markets, we see that scale can be a contributing factor to market power, and then the ability to use that to harm consumers or competition. But it's not the only one. Economies of scale have a role, but you can see network effects, lack of transparency, various other issues, including the ways that data is used. And how that harm might come about is it could be in terms of extracting rents directly from consumers, indirectly via the firm's own business customers, or by excluding competitors. And that harm is more likely to show up in terms of profitability rather than sheer size, something that we highlighted, for example, in the big study we did on digital advertising. I mean, you can really put it in terms of the worry here being last year's scrappy underdog being turned into today's incumbents, and it's how they use that incumbency powers that we tend to worry about. And in the UK context, under the proposed digital markets framework, we have this idea of a strategic market status test, which is intended to be a very high bar and is indeed intended to pay attention to the size of a company, but really to focus on the competitive constraints and identify those firms and those markets where it looks as if competition is unpeat away that power anytime soon.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great to get those perspectives. And also good to hear that big is not bad, because I think often there is a sense implicit that growth is a challenge or is a problem. And I think we've we've established that it isn't. In terms of the underlying policy goals of competition regulation, clearly there are lots of different ways you could measure success. And maybe, Christoph, I would love to hear your perspective on how you see different policy goals emerging and how we can measure effectiveness. Is it just about stimulating economic growth, or are there other factors at play?
Well, if you look at the DMA, the goal is to ensure fair and contestable markets. From this perspective, this is what it's all about. So it's about lowering barriers for entry to competitors, enabling easy switching for customers, no lock-in, innovation. But I think focusing on this economic perspective is maybe too narrow. Competition is not only, in my perspective, about consumer welfare in an economic sense. It's there is also a, let's say, a societal or political dimension. From this perspective, you might say competition is about limiting private concentration of power. So with regard to your earlier question on bigness, I'm not so sure whether bigness could be seen more critical, especially if we are not only talking about markets for, let's say, goods and services, but if we are looking into areas where services of general interest, to use the European terminology, are at stake. We are talking about sectors like healthcare and education, sectors into which tech companies are expanding. So here, bigness controlling access not only to markets, but to essential services in a digital society, that might be more of a problem, I think.
Thank you, Christoph. And I guess maybe a follow-on question. So it's about the distorting effects, or the risks of distorting effects of enormous scale as opposed to the scale itself.
Yeah, and again, if I may, I think it's about the, let's say, the interface between private enterprise and public values, I would say. If we're looking at markets, I share the view that bigness is not a problem per se. It's about the abuse of a dominant position. Perfectly agree. But there are some sectors that are different, where public values are at stake in a much more acute sense, I would say. Healthcare, education are two sectors that I would mention. And here the question is to what extent private entities should control the access to these services, and whether we might end up at some point in a situation where there is not just customer lock-in, but policy lock-in for public entities. And so that is, I think, something that should be kept on the radar in the debate.
Thank you for that nuance. And I think that's very helpful in making it a bit more fine-grained. And moving on to Ulrich, data protection and privacy has obviously been a big journey in the last 5 years since the introduction of the GDPR, and obviously a much longer heritage before that. Do you see a sense of lessons learned from GDPR and similar regulations which can be provided to DMA and similar regulations in the EU?
We learned a number of lessons in the last years. Even it's a very young part of regulation. 4 years, there's still a lack of guidances. There is a lack of decision by courts. So it's not really fixed how the interpretation of data protection law will be at the end. And we have to see on different regulations in the digital area of the markets at the same time, not only on the regulation for data protection and competition, but on specialized like the Digital Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act. We see that the drafts or the proposals have different way of how to regulate. We see that the idea of the one-stop shop is not copied in the same way in other regulations, and we will see of how the intercooperation between surveillance authorities will be installed in practice. We started in Germany back some years a close cooperation between the competition authority and us. We supported them in their case against Facebook in 2019. We encouraged the lawmakers to give more authority to the competition, or more possibilities to act to the competition authority. And we invited Professor Mund, the head of the competition authority, to be part of the reference panel of the Global Privacy Assembly. So the European Commission and the European lawmakers has to have a very close look of how they establish the regulation regime, how they can act swiftly, and in a way that the trust of European citizens is fully fulfilled in the work of the regulation regimes, and how the interaction between competition, data protection, and the new established regulation authorities will be established.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I guess continuing the theme of thinking about this new generation of European and UK regulations, which are focused on thinking in an ex-ante principles-based way about new rules for the road. How would you, maybe a question for Alberto, how would you characterize these new regulations? Do you think the strengths and weaknesses of these principles-based regulations are? And what advice would you give internet companies who are looking to be compliant with these principles-based regulations?
Yeah, certainly. But regarding the strengths and weaknesses of principle-based or ex-ante regulation, I think the first strength that we have identified, and one of the main reasons why we chose to regulate the sector, is that we identified problems that were not confined to single conducts or to single companies, but that they were widespread in the sector. And I think Will rightly so pointed at some characteristic of the technology sector that are conducive to potentially harmful practice from the competition point of view: extreme economies of scale, network effect, use of data. And is banking on the experience of many years of enforcement on a case-by-case basis, that we think we had sufficient elements to draw regulation that will apply across the board, but of course only to what we call the gatekeepers, so only to the companies that are in the position of holding the gates in specific core platform services. So certainly the advantage of the regulation will be that it will apply across the board. It will apply equally to all players in the market. And it also sets out rules that, of course, will need to be declined and interpreted, but that are open and transparent to everyone. The disadvantages of regulation are a little bit mirroring the advantages. It applies to everyone. It allows less fine-tuning. It also takes a snapshot of the situation in the markets in a specific point in time. And over time, two things will certainly occur. The markets will evolve. The issue we will have to tackle will probably change. We will have new models. We may have new platforms, new markets. And there is some future proofing in the DMA, but at some point in time, like all legislation, will be probably old and needed to be revised. And a little bit on the same line, market players will adapt their behavior to the new regulatory and legislative environment. So, and there again, case-by-case analysis under antitrust will be precious as a complement, or the DMA will be a complement to antitrust analysis, and both will be very important going forward. And but the advice to the potential gatekeepers, I'm not sure I can give them a lot, because they're very well resourced, and they have been looking at this legislation for quite some time now, and I'm certain they are making up their opinion about it. But the only thing I will say, which is very well known, is that establishing a dialogue early on is probably the best way to go about. It is the responsibility of the gatekeepers to come forward and to propose how they will comply with the regulation. But obviously, we are very open for discussion, and this is starting as we speak, and it will intensify as soon as there will be full clarity about the text of the Digital Markets Act and about the timing of its entry into force.
Thank you very much for that perspective, Alberto. And the point about dialogue, I think, is well heard in terms of the opportunity to work through some of the ambiguity and create clarity. Will, as you're thinking about the next generation of competition thinking in the digital markets unit, how do you think about ex-ante principles-based regulations? Are your views aligned with Alberto's? How is the UK differing, if at all?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, there were really two questions in there, aren't there? One about ex-ante, one about principles-based. Yeah. So just pick them up somewhat separately. I mean, Alberto's covered some of the ground on the strengths of ex-ante versus ex-post. I mean, you can put it crudely and say that with the ex-post approach, you end up playing whack-a-mole in these interconnected and complex markets. So what an ex-ante framework is intended to do is to set the rules of the game up front, trying to head off some of the harm before it happens, rather than waiting for it to happen and then chase after it. It should certainly be able to move faster once it's established that regulation is needed. In our case, through this SMS designation, it's then not needed to reprove that each time we need to change the rules. So it should enable us to do that and move more quickly. Broadly speaking, we can do much better on remedy design, we think, using this kind of framework than using ex-post competition enforcement, which is quite poorly suited to that. And in general, it's the ability, I think this is also what Alberto was getting at, to join things up and have a joined up coherent approach across markets and adapt that over time. I would say, though, that the precise effectiveness of it is all in the execution. So, and there are some differences here in terms of how the UK's proposed approach is intended to work versus that in the EU. I should say this is, I'll largely refer here to the CMA's views, which are not necessarily exactly the same as where the government will end up, or indeed where Parliament will. But broadly speaking, the approach that we felt right was that the detailed rules shouldn't be in legislation and should rather be set out at a very high level in legislation, with the specifics to be determined in a process then by the regulator, which then allows greater adaptation over time as those new business models come along, as things change and we see the evidence adapt. So we think that's the right kind of targeted, proportionate, flexible, evidence-based approach. But I mean, even then, again, the effectiveness is in the execution. So if you replace market failure by regulatory failure, that's a bad outcome too. You can get regulatory capture. This was, I think, a little bit back to some of Christoph's comments about, I think he called it policy lock-in. So that's something to look out for. One wants to avoid overreach, so you need the right checks and balances. It's also, I should say, bad news if regulators think they know all the answers. So hence the need to test, trial, and adapt regulation over time. Just briefly on the principles-based question, I mean, not all ex-ante regulation is principles-based. In having those principles, that can avoid having to write a detailed rule book, which can be good news, again, for reasons of flexibility. And it places some burden on the firms in question to demonstrate compliance in a thoughtful way rather than relying on a kind of tick box exercise. But again, it's all in the execution. And I recall having sat in a workshop among the energy sector in the UK when the regulator was considering moving from detailed rules to principles. And what you heard was enthusiasm up front about this whole idea, but then the firms effectively clamoring for more understanding and detail, and effectively rewriting in guidance what might have been in the rules in the first place. And that would be a failure if that's where you end up, because you've just recreated the same detailed rule book by another route.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the advantage and the weakness of the European UK approach, as compared to some of the ex post attempts in the US to use older laws to litigate against perceived illegality, gives a lot of flexibility, as you said. But obviously, the proof is in the pudding. The design of those rules is really important, and getting that right has a huge sensitivity on the future effectiveness of the regulation. We're seeing a number of different initiatives. Obviously, the EU's Digital Markets Act, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, and other laws around the world, including in China. Do we think that these are broadly different fronts of the same kind of set of initiatives, or is it a case that firms should be thinking about different paradigms depending on which part of the world they're in? And if so, is that by intent, or is that a failing of global kind of alignment? I guess this is a pretty big question. I don't think there is anyone with a full view. Any perspectives from the group on that one?
Perhaps on the last part of the question, if there are differences, if it is by intent or by failure of alignment. But what I would say is that in different jurisdictions, there are different nuances on how the problem is perceived. But above all, achieving an agreement of regulation is a complex problem in itself. Which in Europe, as everyone knows, involved member states and the parliament or the proposal of the commission, and so on. So we are, in a way, quite happy already that we find an agreement amongst 27 countries, and to have a coherent piece of legislation that applies to such a large zone. To think that we could fully align globally, I think, would require a governance system at global level that simply is not there. On the other hand, the issues are very much the same. They are very, very similar. And I think there is an increasing sense that we need a common response to these issues. But that doesn't mean everyone the same, but it means interventions that are coherent with one another, or certainly, and that's the minimum goal, they are not in contradiction with one another, and it will require a lot of dialogue rather than full convergence on every comma of the law.
Thank you. I'm going to take a brief pause and encourage the audience, if you have questions to pose to this brilliant panel, please use the Q&A tab in your browser to type in questions. We'll be able to see them and I can ask them to the panel. So please do pose your questions. We'll continue with this discussion, but in the meantime, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. So for those listening, if you have questions, type them in and I can ask them. Moving into, sorry.
Yeah, so Nick, we have 3 freshly brewed acts on the paper, even in Europe, just on the paper, and we know that there's a difference in all three regions from what comes from paper to the work in practice. But that such three regions are working on legislation, on regulation, shows that there is something going on, that it's important to have that regulation. I'm a computer scientist from profession, and so I'm a fan of digitalization, and I'm aware of all the benefits that it brings with it in every aspect of our life. But we see the disadvantages, and this is regulation for. And it will be interesting for a regulator like me to see which instruments will be the most effective in the long run. So take interoperability as a technical, even complex question, as a legally complex question, but as an instrument which is promising to really lower the hurdles for market entrance from a competition side, giving innovation space back for privacy-friendly technologies. So in the best, we will have for the best regulation scheme. But really, we have to look out for how we can combine these instruments and how we can create a level playing field and enforce our own regulation, even on globally working companies, and a free flow of data.
Yeah, thank you, Ulrich. Appreciate that. One of the studies which we had conducted at Deloitte last year envisaged different futures for the European tech sector. And three of them were broadly positive, one of them was not so positive, and we dubbed it the tech wasteland, which was quite a gloomy outlook, and it envisaged a overreaching failure of regulation which resulted in a stifling of access to capital, a talent exodus, and broadly a very nasty picture for the next 5 to 10 years if regulation is not executed successfully. Christoph, looking broadly across different sectors and thinking about the possible futures, how do you think that we can avoid this kind of gloomy outlook with the right implementation of competition regulation in Europe?
Well, looking into the future is a daunting task, I would say. But this being said, I think that the DMA actually holds the potential to change something, to make things better, and to open up markets, especially I would say at the periphery of the digital economy. The DMA distinguishes between core platform services and other services. And if you look, for example, at digital identity services, payment services, recommender systems as a service, you might say, filtering services as a service. If these complementary services are, if we see more competition in these areas, also easier entry for European businesses into these areas, payment services, digital identity, and let's say diversity of recommender systems, this I think would be a more desirable future. So if the DMA lives up to the expectation, which, and I perfectly agree with the other speakers, that very much depends on effective enforcement here. But if this works, I think we can see growth, especially in these areas.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I've seen a question from the audience, and it's from Matt Sinclair, who is one of my colleagues at Deloitte. What does the growth of TikTok in video sharing platforms or Amazon in ads tell us about the dynamics in digital markets? Is there a risk that we are fighting the last war, or thinking about a market which is much less fluid than the one we actually are seeing. And I guess this is maybe a question maybe for Alberto. I'd love to hear your perspective. Are we trying to stimulate something which doesn't need more stimulation?
Yeah, it's. I think the question is as old as competition law, and I think eventually, probably yes, probably there will be entry. Probably eventually, everything will change to an extent that whatever company is dominant now will not be. The question is, is a bit like in the long term, we are all dead anyway. The question for us is not to see what eventually will happen, is to make, as Christoph just said, the conditions such that right now it is possible actually to challenge and to open new opportunities. And what we have observed through antitrust enforcement is that this is generally or often not the case, that there are startups now that come and tell us, I cannot develop my product because I'm foreclosed. So I cannot develop. And we have, and this is happening right now. Of course, Amazon is expanding that, that's perhaps not the best example, as they have the means and the resources. They're not exactly a startup, actually, to spend the enormous amounts that are necessary to enter in markets where barriers to entry are huge, and possibly because they need to defend their position in a neighboring market, and the best strategy is actually to invest in the market of their competitors. But the question we should be asking is this the general conditions in these markets, or is it not? And also about the wasteland scenario, certainly if we don't enforce properly, we can do harm to the economy. But also having an economy where the reasoning goes, we cannot enforce competition, for example, because venture capital only invests because they look at their exit strategy, and their exit strategy is being bought up by one of the dominant companies, and by not allowing that, you competition authority actually reduce the amount of capital available to startups. I think there is something really flawed in these reasonings. Venture capital, risk capital should go to the opportunities to really challenge the incumbents, not to be sold to incumbents. So besides pointy examples, I rather see a market where there is much less development than there, and the possibility to grow than there was 20 years ago, when the current giants were very clever, innovative startups bringing something new to the market.
I really like that positivity, Alberto, and Will. I would love to hear your perspective on what do you see as a flourishing ecosystem opportunity for the UK?
Well, I suppose just to make a general point on the question, and then a couple of specifics on the particular companies that were mentioned. When the general point is, this exactly the question itself underlines the need to be modest about our ability to predict the future and to really look at the evidence. So we would want to do that in any assessment we made, whether it's of a strategic market status review or setting the rules that are associated with that. I mean, on the specific questions, when we did our big study on digital advertising, TikTok was pretty small. It's obviously now bigger, but and I should say that this is not based on the sort of full assessment, but the numbers associated with TikTok are quite hard to come by, or to be verified. But they are still, it seems, much smaller in terms of advertising revenue than Facebook. I think we're talking factors of tens or more smaller. And then Amazon is another interesting story, and just goes to show that not all advertising is equal, and we need to understand the context in which it's being seen. So obviously that element of the advertising market is being used in the context of a retail environment, which is a quite different environment to general search, which in turn is quite a different environment to social media. So back to the general point, you need to understand the specifics before you can really come to a view. But as Alberto says, what we're really worried about here is contestability and openness of markets and the ability of someone else to come along and knock the market leaders off their perch, which is the thing we worry that there isn't sufficiently in evidence at the moment.
Thank you. And maybe going back to that question I posed about the kind of envisaging a really positive future for a flourishing tech sector. Do you see that as I mean, I guess the regulation would be necessary, but is it sufficient? What else needs to be in place to ensure that there's a really thriving, competitive ecosystem of successful entrants in the UK?
So I think the question you've just asked has been asked by plenty of different people in different contexts and could be put as described as a question as big as, for example, why is there no Silicon Valley in the UK? And that probably encompasses a whole lot of different areas of public policy, many of which I'm not very well qualified to comment on. How financial markets work and listings and VC and clusters and place-based strategy and all those sorts of things. So all those I think are probably likely to be ingredients, but rather than I wouldn't presume to comment on those. I think if you look at the competitive landscape, as I said, what you want is the prospect of being able to succeed as a startup, and the prospect, at least in principle, of being able to knock one of the big firms off their perch. If you think about where the innovation will come from, it might either come from companies that are competing against the incumbents. It might come from companies that are using incumbent services as an input to something that they might be providing, or indeed you want to see the innovation coming from the incumbents themselves. And all of those things are promoted if the conditions for fair and open competition are there, because you'll see greater pressure on the incumbent, which if anything leads them to push harder on innovation, and you have the scope for a newer provider to see the ability to compete. I mean, in fact, just last week I was talking to a rival social media firm with a very privacy-focused sort of marketing position and a product offer. And what you could see there was that, and this links to the whole field of data protection as well. What you could see there was that it's very difficult for them to compete with that kind of offer against an environment where you have all these, in quotes, free services, where what's happening with people's data is not well understood. And so you could imagine there even a sort of work needing to be done around consumer understanding to support effective choice, which is something that underlies both consumer protection and data protection.
Yeah, that's a beautiful segue. I'd love to come to Ulrich in terms of thinking about consumer data as currency or proxy for currency. The EU's New Deal for Consumers is a piece of legislation which has recently focused on consumer protection, but it starts treating services which are paid for, quote unquote, by access to data, and it making them equivalent to those which are paid for with normal money. So, Ulrich, I would love to have your perspective on that point about how you think about services which are driven by access to data, either first party, third party. What's your perspective here?
We must never forget that privacy is a civil right, and it's not part of consumer protection, but more deeply installed in our value system. So there is no possibility, even if wanted, to limit the scope of privacy at that point. The DMA and the DSA and even the DA are regulations which want to show how the sharing of data, how access to data, how the right of data owners, to use that word, without the idea of a real tradable ownership at that point has their role in that environment. And we see the possibility of business cases based on the processing of personalized data, not just for a service for the data subject itself, but gaining experiences, gaining learning effects for the general good, or for training AI systems, for offering such services to other persons. Where we see limits is in really building up profiles. That's a way of spying on people. And this is not compatible with the idea and the values of privacy in behind. But this is, in the end, not a limit to innovation, because there are alternatives to that, alternatives of the way how you create the services, how you do use a privacy-friendly design on that, and you have to rely then on an enforcing regulation. If you yourself using the privacy-friendly design, you cannot accept that other companies just play unfair, hoping that even 3, 4, 5 years after installing a regulation, no one is coming to enforce. And the second part is not just the privacy-friendly design, but privacy-friendly technologies. There are alternatives of how to handle that. In these days, I try to convince people that, for example, the idea of federated learning is a way of how Europeans can bring on innovation in working with even sensitive personal information, in a way of getting as much information out of the personal data for establishing business cases, for getting a scientific output out of it. And that's the way of understanding what framework the regulation is setting, and which technologies and which business cases, and of the way of how business cases are created can flourish inside that framework.
Thank you. And I guess this point about how you measure the value of the effects of regulation. So in the 20th century, a lot of the focus of competition regulation was on consumer pricing and consumer choice. Looking at the next century, Christoph, maybe you could share a perspective, and I will then go to Will and to Alberto. What is the measure, the yardstick of success for competition? Is it about those traditional points around consumer choice and consumer pricing, or is it a much more structural sense and thinking about other dimensions across the whole economy? So maybe Christoph, your perspective, and then we'll hear from Will and from Alberto.
Yeah, if I may, I would like to add one thought on what Ulrich just said regarding this tension between consumer law and data protection. My reading of this debate about the controversial notion of data as consideration, data as price, is that those who advocate this perspective do not seek to reduce the protection of personal data as a civil right, as Ulrich has rightly said. I think this is rather about extending consumer protection law to scenarios where consumers do not pay a monetary price, and to ensure that consumer protection rules also apply to these zero price contracts. So it's about extending consumer protection, not reducing the protection of personal data. But of course, reconciling these two perspectives is a challenge. I agree. Now, to the question of price. I would say measuring competition by means of price effects is too narrow. And especially if you look at zero price markets or attention markets, diversity, choice, autonomy are also values that may serve as a measure for workable competition. Do I have a choice between different recommender systems on social media? I think this is also a part of consumer welfare in a broader sense that transcends a narrow economic perspective. The only problem is if you add these perspectives into the assessment of competition, things get more complex. It's more difficult to quantify, but I think it's necessary in order to have a more holistic and more realistic perspective on what competition is about.
Thank you. And over to Will, your perspective on the tension. Is it about price and choice, or how far do you go in terms of trying to optimize with competition law?
Yeah, thank you. I'm also going to range over both the topics that have been raised in the last couple of questions.
Cool. Thank you.
And just to agree with much of what Christoph just said on the interactions between privacy and competition. So we feel very strongly that privacy and competition objectives can be, in fact, complementary rather than necessarily in tension. Indeed, those who seek to put them in tension are often, we think, seeking to use data protection as a sort of privacy washing tool to support positions of market power. And we produced a joint statement with our Information Commissioner's Office in the UK almost a year ago, where we set out thinking, and then that thinking has then been borne out in the case that we've been running under our Competition Act in the UK on Google's removal of third-party cookies from Chrome, which is the so-called privacy sandbox proposals. So yes, just to underline the point that we think that those two things can be complementary, and also complementary in that for them both to work well, they both need informed decision making by people, whether that's people in the terms of data protection or in terms of as consumers. Just then on your question about price and consumer outcomes, I mean, I'd slightly dispute the terms of the question, actually. So we in competition policy always think about consumer welfare. That's what we're really all about. But I think the difference around the world has been in ways that's been. So I think your question was right in terms of the US in particular, in terms of this idea that, or this is the equation of consumer welfare most closely with price. I think we here in the UK think that we've always been able to think more broadly about consumer welfare, and that's price, but it's also choice, as Christoph was also saying, and it's quality and it's innovation. And once you think about those four things, that really enables you to take a pretty broad view of what makes a good consumer outcome, and it means that you can think, as we think you should, about not just the outcome today, tomorrow, but also in the longer term future. And so it's a rather broader sense of what a consumer outcome means. Some of that stuff, of course, is rather harder to measure than simple prices today, of course, so that makes the job harder. But we do think it's really important to think about that dynamic competition, not just what's going on right now.
Thank you, Will. I really like that phrase, consumer welfare, as an ambition. Alberto, do you agree with Will? Is that a same sort of way you think about it?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, he mentioned price, of course, but choice, quality, and innovation. And in fact, in particular, protecting innovation has seen some of the perhaps more significant interventions that we have done looking into future markets, and sometimes protecting innovation spaces, which is a concept that seems abstract, but also where we intervened to make sure not even that future products could continue to exist after mergers, particularly big chemical mergers, Dow DuPont, but that we protected the possibility to have innovation spaces, to have the possibilities to continue innovating by two different companies instead of merging innovation capacity into one, which sometimes brings efficiencies, sometimes brings reduction of budgets and reduction of the possibility to innovate. I think this translates also in the technology space very much, and we also observed a strategy, of course, of incumbent companies with very deep pockets, for whom it is a perfectly sensible defensive strategy to acquire any future potential threat or competitor, and maybe not to kill. So there is a lot of debate about killer acquisitions, but perhaps not to kill, but certainly to make compatible within their existing ecosystem. So to avoid to have another ecosystem that could threaten their core business. I think we do have a big responsibility indeed to protect this type of competition. As everyone said, it is complicated. It requires a lot of looking into the future. Looking in the future means grappling with uncertainty, but it is possible, and certainly something that we will do more and more in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen Ulrich, were you going to say something?
Yes, Nick, I do agree to almost everything the other speakers said, but let me give one example for where there's a complementary role between the both regulation regimes and where there may be tension. So first example, the idea from the Digital Act, for example, that the users of some machine sensors are the owners of the data they are created, will give them a better position than they have in these days when they are driving a car, when they're using some machines on the farms. If companies, not only individuals, companies use machines for producing or establishing a service. That would be a great step forward. Today, the European Data Protection Board and the European Data Protection Supervisor established a joint position on the Digital Act. It will be published the next few days, in the moment where all the work is done on the text. And we, in one part, we show, for example, if the contract will be the standard for the processing of personalized data. There is a tension, because we have to ask the question if the contract can really follow the same important limitations, other ways of legal basis for that processing have. So, for example, the consent has the idea it has to be concrete. It has to be, you have to be well informed for consent. The consent has to be voluntarily, and voluntarily means even not being cut off by any service by the situation. And there has to be a simple way for the withdrawal of such a consent. Is that still in place with a contract? And what about the purpose binding and the purpose limitation of the processing of data? We've learned that in all situations where companies try to establish contracts as the base for data processing, there were tries behind that to go beyond the normal scope of which data can be aggregated, which data can be processed, which kind of profiles can be built. And we have to answer that question. What is the tension and maybe the complementary role between the legal basis for data processing in the GDPR and the basis which comes from the other acts now in the European Union?
Thank you. We have about just less than 5 minutes remaining, and there's One question and one other topic which I would love to cover with this group. So the question which Ben, our conference host, has asked is about the benefits of Bigness and talking about network effects. And I guess the risk which Ben has asked is, does limiting the reach of platforms reduce their usefulness? So is utility, which comes from scale, an aspect of consumer welfare? Any thoughts on that perspective, on that question, Will, perhaps?
I think this comes down to remedy design. So where you have market power that is particularly underpinned by network effects, you need to recognize that. And then it could be, for example, that one of the main ways to tackle that is through an interoperability requirement. But the nice thing about an interoperability requirement, if designed well, is that it doesn't have to undermine the network effects of the original company. What it can do is increase the likelihood that other companies might come along and be able to share in that network effect, if you like. So to make it most as specific as possible, in our advertising study, when we talked about potential remedies in relation to Facebook, we talked about an interoperability requirement, which wouldn't mean full protocol interoperability across the entirety of the Facebook service, for the risk that might itself limit innovation, but rather some specific elements of that service, for example, cross-posting and finding friends, for example, which would allow others to have that barrier to entry reduced in terms of the network effects, but doesn't stop Facebook itself continuing to benefit from those. And it doesn't even touch on size in a crude sense at all. So as I said, it's all down to remedy design and all down to the specifics of a particular set of concerns in a given market.
Thank you, Will. And Alberto, the DMA has interoperability featuring extensively throughout. Does that unfairly harm companies whose business model is built on vertical integration and kind of seamless layering of silicon to hardware to operating systems to software to apps and so on?
But I think I will echo what Will just said. Not necessarily. If it is well executed, it opens up possibility, but it doesn't exclude the capacity of these companies to keep offering their service and their model as it is, and it will be for consumers to be able to choose. And again, probably this goes back to what I said in the very, very beginning. At the point in time, there are special responsibilities upon companies that have become dominant, not to create an environment that effectively shuts out competition or shuts the possibility to bring innovative features. And that we observe this is the case, or very simply exploits also from a price point of view their must have status. So in this, of course, there will be less, their business model will have to change. This is undoubted, but it does not need to undermine it. Actually, it will have to make them consumers want their business model even more.
Thank you very much, Alberto. We are now in the final minute or so I think we should sum up. I want to thank the panel very much indeed for such a wide-ranging, illuminating discussion. One of the themes which I took away here is the interconnectedness. I think we've all agreed that the complexity and the devil is in the detail, not just with remedy design, but also with many other aspects of this, and the tensions between competition, but also consumer protection, with freedom of expression, with underlying human rights, with privacy and data protection. There are lots of different things which regulators need to cooperate and think about. And this is clearly a theme which will continue in the next few years to come. So just to wrap up, thank you, Ulrich, thank you, Alberto, thank you, Will and Christoph. And just to echo Will's point, it was a real shame in this panel there was a lack of female representation, but I know that across the other panels in this RAID conference there is a better balance. So thank you for calling that out, Will. Thank you all. I'll hand back to Ben.